There have been many bloody periods in human history when torture and executions were perceived as something ordinary. The screams of prisoners almost never ceased behind the high walls of prison, and pools of blood in the main squares appeared to form lakes. And perhaps one of the cruelest executions was invented by the wild tribes of Scandinavia, whom we usually call Vikings. I'm talking about the Blood Eagle, a legendary execution from Viking themes. The execution supposedly originated during the early Middle Ages in Scandinavia and was usually applied to high-ranking enemies taken prisoner. For example, it is mentioned that the Anglo-Saxon king Ella, who killed Ragnar Lothbrok, the father of Ivar the Boneless, was executed in this way as revenge. This event is recounted by the 11th century poet Sigvar Fodresen in a verse called Kunstdrapa. The execution consisted of breaking the victim's ribs on the sides with an axe, then making incisions and pulling out the ribs to resemble wings. After that, the still alive victim would have his lungs pulled out and placed so that breathing would make the improvised wings move. After all this, the still living person was tied up on ropes and lifted up for public viewing. It is assumed that this execution was not only a cruel method of murder and intimidation, but also some kind of religious sacrifice in the name of the supreme Scandinavian god, Odin. However, the existence of this execution is highly doubtful because the existence of Ragnar Lothbrok or Ivar the Boneless has never been proven by anything but sagas and legends. As for King Ella, the exact details of his death, except that he died in battle with the Normans, are unknown. But unlike the Blood Eagle, the following execution definitely existed, and probably was not inferior in cruelty and sophistication to the Blood Eagle, and was used by Europeans up until the mid-19th century: the wheel. The breaking wheel is an ancient type of torture and execution, which was invented in ancient Rome, and one of its first uses is attributed to the cruel Roman Emperor Commodus. And back then, this execution would look like this. However, in the Middle Ages in Europe, execution already looked different. For example, in the Holy Roman Empire, executions were a mass spectacle and were used primarily for men convicted of aggravated murder, that is, committed during another crime or against a family member. The documents of the Holy Roman Empire even preserved a description of the execution. First, the criminal is placed belly down, hands and feet tied to a board, and in this manner, a horse drags him to the place of execution. Then the body is struck twice on each arm, one blow above the elbow, the other below. Then, the same is done to each leg, above and below the knee. The last 9th blow is struck in the middle of the spine so that it breaks. The broken body is then inserted into a wheel, that is between the spokes, and then the wheel is driven onto a pole, which is then fixed vertically with the other end in the ground. Then the criminal was left to die afloat on the wheel and let rot. But there is another method of this execution originating from Europe. A wheel was placed on a tripod and then rotated while the convict was tortured. The difference between this method and the others was that those watching from all sides could get a good view without the executioner having to go around the wheel. Sometimes, a criminal's ankles and wrists could be broken beforehand before being placed on the wheel in order to twist them, and thus tie the person to the wheel, causing more suffering. Perhaps, the most famous and cruel instance of the use of this execution occurred on October 1st, 1786 in the county of Tecklenburg. Heinrich Stahl was to be executed by means of the wheel for the aggravated murder of a Jew. The first blow of the wheel would crush his chest. It was thought that it would kill the criminal instantly. However, this blow did not kill the criminal, and even the townspeople who were familiar with public executions were shocked by such a cruel punishment, because Dole was alive throughout the whole process. After the executioner secured Dole to the wheel, he hoisted him onto a pole. The town doctor climbed the ladder and verified that Dole was indeed alive. He died 6 hours later in terrible agony. The wheel was one of the most cruel and inhumane forms of execution and torture in history. It was intended not only to punish criminals, but also to demonstrate power and terrorize the population. And the most interesting thing is that in Germany, the wheel was used almost until the middle of the 19th century. It was used as a method of execution in Bavaria until 1813 and was still used until 1836 in Hesse-Kassel. However, the next execution, although it hid the whole process of killing the criminal from the spectators, was not inferior in cruelty to the wheel. I'm talking about the Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden is both an instrument of torture and execution, supposedly used in the Middle Ages to punish criminals. Its description varies from source to source. Generally, it is an upright wooden or metal box with nails, spikes, or sharp blades on the inside. Sometimes, it is described as a device possessing the form of a human silhouette, as an Egyptian sarcophagus, and sometimes as a cylindrical case with a mask in the form of a woman's head on top. The latter version of the device is the most popular, thanks to which it got its name. The criminal or victim was placed inside the device, and then the door was closed, causing them pain and suffering. There are different variations of the description of the mechanism of the Iron Maiden. In one variation, the condemned person was placed in a vertical sarcophagus studded with blades or spikes, and then the lid would begin to close smoothly and slowly, penetrating the person with blades from the front, which forced them to move backward, pressing against the blades on the backside as well. All this continued until the sarcophagus was completely closed, after which it was left closed for some time, letting the man, or what was left of him, bleed out. The second variation of the Iron Maiden includes a pressure mechanism, and in some sources, is considered the first example of such an instrument of execution. This variant was invented back in the days of Sparta by the ruler Nabis. According to legend, this type of Iron Maiden was not in the form of a sarcophagus, but had the image of Nabis's wife, Aliga. The instrument was a female statue with the face of Aliga dotted with nails along the chest and arms. When the ruler decided to execute someone, the instrument was brought into the hall, after which the statue's arms were spread, and the condemned person was placed in front of it. Nabis himself stood behind and pressed on the back of the Iron Maiden to make her embrace the victim, pressing the nails harder and harder into the flesh of the guilty. However, the Iron Maiden is considered a mythical rather than a real tool. Many historians assume that information about the use of such a tool as the Iron Maiden was invented around the 16th to 18th century, because the oldest example of this tool was supposedly created only in the 16th century, and there is no accurate information about its use, and the basement of the fortress where it was located was destroyed during World War II. In written sources, this instrument of execution was described simply as a sarcophagus with sharp spikes inside. All specimens of the Iron Maiden that we can now observe in museums are just an approximation of what this design might have looked like if it had existed and been used in antiquity. And while the existence of the Iron Maiden is highly questionable, there's no doubt about the existence of a type of execution called crushing. Execution by crushing is one of the oldest methods of execution. It is based on the use of various heavy objects to crush the victim's entire body or individual limbs, resulting in a painful and often slow death. There are several variants and methods of application of classical execution by crushing. The perpetrator is secured on a wheel or platform, and then a heavy object such as a large stone or roller is lifted over them, which is gradually lowered or dropped all at once, crushing the person. The criminal is secured on a special platform, and the executioners then use a vice to crush the convict's limbs, causing fatal injuries. The criminal is placed on the ground, and then large, heavy stones are placed on his body one by one until the victim dies. But there are also particularly sophisticated ways to crush a person. For example, in the South and Southeast of Asia, a popular method of execution was when a bound man was laid on the ground, and then an elephant stepped on him. And this method was quite well established in that area because it was used for more than 4,000 years. To give an example from more recent history, we can remember the case of the Salem witch trials. And in spite of the fact that we associate the Salem witch trials with the burning of those accused of witchcraft at the stake, crushing was also used at the time. And it was applied to an 81-year-old farmer named Giles Corey, who was also accused of witchcraft, and instead of pleading guilty or not guilty as other members of his community had done, chose to remain silent in court. This led the court to impose a compulsory measure. Giant stones were placed on the accused in an attempt to get the farmer to confess guilt by crushing him. Corey was crushed to death by the stones. The other 19 Salem witches were not burned at the stake either. They were simply hanged. After all, this was the method of execution used in Britain and its colonies for those convicted of witchcraft. But do not think that burning is a myth. This following execution existed, and in Europe, it was applied to witches and not limited to them. Execution by burning has been widespread in various cultures and eras, and its use has been associated with punishment for serious crimes, political reprisals, religious intolerance, or even simple accusations of witchcraft or hearsay. In execution by burning, a person was bound and placed on a pyre, which was then set on fire, subjecting the victim to the flames. The process of burning could be slow and extremely painful. Often, the executioners kept an eye on the flames, preventing them from getting too hot, deliberately prolonging the victim's agony. One of the most famous examples of the use of execution by burning is the period of the Age of Witches in Europe. Women accused of witchcraft, association with the devil, or committing various unexplained phenomena were considered witches and were subject to this method of execution. Though the majority of victims were women, men also suffer this fate. The process of accusing and executing witches was usually full of superstition, improper trials, and torture to coerce confessions. Often, the trial lasted only a couple of minutes, during which time the accused was read the charges and immediately found guilty without being given a chance to defend themselves. But beyond witches, this execution was very closely intertwined with the Holy Inquisition and probably even became its symbol. The historian Hernando del Purgar estimated that between 1,478 and 1,490 to 2,000 people were burned at the stake. And how many more people were burned alive during the entire period of the fight against heresy can only be guessed. Ancient Rome also used this type of execution. The Roman state regarded burning at the stake as a horrible punishment, intended as a demonstration of power and intimidation. The Muscovy Kingdom also liked to execute people by burning, but they had their own interesting variation of this execution. There, it was more like being smoked alive rather than burned. For example, in 1701, it was applied to men who distributed leaflets defaming the honor of Pete the Great. For this, they were suspended on a scaffold, and for 8 hours, they were smoked with a corrosive composition from which the condemned men lost all the hair on their bodies and their skin melted like wax. However, it is not known for sure whether they were smoked to death because different sources speak about different things. According to some sources, the bodies eventually burned together with the scaffold. According to others, the convicts began to repent, as a result of which they were removed from the scaffold, interrogated, and sent to Siberia. Some religious practices also utilize the burning of people as a sacrifice to the gods. For example, in ancient Mexico, the Aztecs conducted rituals in which people were sacrificed to the gods by burning. These executions were part of their religious beliefs and cultural practices. Celtic tribes also had a similar ritual of burning, but with very different methods from the sacrifices of other people. The Celts came up with possibly the most brutal ritual in history. I'm talking about the Wicker Man, but that's another topic. However, if you want us to make a video about the most brutal sacrifices, write us about it in the comments. And also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like. If you want to support the channel financially, the link to our Patreon page is in the description. See you soon.